Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We are so excited. We have for you guys Dr. Enette Larson-Meyer with us. Thank you, Enette, for joining us. We are so excited to have you.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this. It should be fun.
I am so excited. Well, our listeners have heard your bio. They know the rundown of how our episodes work. I'm going to let you, Enette, break us down your two truths and a lie, or a lie and two truths, however you want to layer them down.
Oh, okay. All right. So I guess you get to pick out which one is the lie from the statement. And since our theme is nutrition assessment, I thought I would go with something related to that. So the first one is a single Brazil nut easily provides the RDA, or the dietary reference intake, for selenium. Truth or well, that was just totally accident. Truth or lie, question number 2. Beef, pork, and poultry are the best, most absorbable sources of magnesium. And number 3 is regular consumption of green leafy vegetables, which are rich in vitamin K1, may be important for helping fix calcium in bone, and therefore is really needed for optimal bone health for athletes.
Ooh. Oh, man. Okay, this is where I get nervous and I'm afraid I'm going to embarrass myself on the podcast when the researchers give me pop quiz questions. So I'm pretty certain Brazil nut and selenium is in fact true. That was like one of the I had a saying, one Brazil nut a day keeps selenium deficiency at bay, I think was one of my takeaways from my undergrad. The beef, pork, best absorbable sources of magnesium. That one I'm wondering a little bit about. And then the regular consumption of green vegetables, I'm well aware that there is vitamin K in those. And I didn't know K. I'm more familiar, I think, with K2 in bone health, but maybe you'll correct me on that. I kind of think I'm going to go with the beef and poultry as the lie. Amanda, what's your guess?
Feel like I just got to go with your guess.
Okay.
I feel like the regular consumption of green leafy veggies, I don't know anything. I don't know about the K1, but seems like it could be plausible.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to go with the middle one, the beef and poultry being the best absorbable source of magnesium as the lie. But don't tell us the answer, Annette. We're going to save it for our listeners at the end. Hopefully everyone's going to learn some nuggets from this two truths and a lie. But first, why don't you break it down a little bit for us, Annette? What got you excited to get into this field of research?
Yeah. So it's funny. I was always, I guess, growing up, someone who was very interested in nutrition and diet. I was a 4-H kid. And then I got really interested in both of them together and went off to do my dietetic internship, expecting I was going to do clinical dietetics. And then I had a patient on my floor die within. Very nice man. It was very sad, and I didn't take it very well. And I realized that other people were fine. They're like, well, not fine, but they're like, yeah, it's a hospital. Unfortunately, people die, and I'm crying. So shortly after that, I went to do a optional rotation at the General Clinical Research Center. And I was at Mass General, and I walked on the floor, and the dietitian was busy, and she said, can you go in there and just start reading some protocols in there, and I'll come get you in a little bit. And I opened them up, and I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so exciting. And I was reading them over, and I think in the truth, she said later, she said to stay for a little bit and then come in because she was working, and I didn't. And then she came to find me and she said, what are you doing? I'm like, oh my God, I'm reading all these things. I'm so So I think from that point on, I realized I wanted to do more health and wellness kind of stuff, preventative stuff, and then which was really going to be part of what I wanted to do.
That's awesome. I had a similar experience when I was doing my internship at the UC Davis Medical Center. It was, the best way to describe it is just, it was very depressing. And then I got to do like a bonus internship with Dr. Liz Applegate in the sports nutrition. And I got in and I just absolutely fell in love and I was like, this is what I want to do. But yeah, it took me a while to figure out how to get there. But I totally understand what yeah, that's rough, very rough. Well, we want to be certainly mindful of your time and get our listeners all this wonderful information. So you've published loads of research articles. So if our listeners want to look up on PubMed, anything there, Enette has amazing publications out there from a sports nutrition lens. But today we're going to dive into your publication, Nutrition Assessment of the Athlete. And can you kind of first start with maybe like what drove you to do this publication and look and put the puzzle pieces together to put this out there for coaches and folks like myself?
Yeah, so it has a really interesting background because it was part of an International Olympic Committee consensus statement, and every other talk was about dietary supplements, which ones work, various different aspects of them. But this piece was thrown in there for the importance of, before you recommend anything, you should make sure that you should do a nutrition assessment, or make sure that, you're eating right and that there isn't, any drug nutrient interactions already, or any medications that might interfere with the supplements. So that's sort of its whole entire piece. And then diving into it, it was really a lot of fun to do, realizing that there was a couple of very long textbooks on the topic, but not really an article particularly geared at the athlete. So we had a lot of fun doing it. Co-authors were Louise Burke at well, I guess now she's at Catholic Australian University, and then Kathy Wolf, who's in New York.
Amazing. Wow. Well, those are some big names too to help you with the paper. So in the article, you broke down, I think, a very helpful framework. You called it the ABCDE assessment framework. Can you share with us what that is and maybe take a little time getting into each of those categories?
Sure. Yeah. And I've liked it because I think it helps students and young, practitioners when you're coming in think what it is. And also thinking about all the pieces that you need comprehensively. So A is assessment, is anthropometric, and it's body weight, body height, body composition, if that's appropriate to do. And then B is biochemical. Sometimes blood is what people think about, but then when you just do blood, you forget that urine is sometimes one of our best markers. And then C is clinical, and looking at clinical history. And also, now that dietitians are doing nutrition-focused physical exam, that's included in there, or looking at the physician notes, those components. And then drug nutrient interactions is in C. And then D, of course, is diet. It's the one we're most comfortable with, that we typically do as dietitians or think about. Or even athletes and coaches, we always think, oh yeah, it's the diet. But again, there's the other piece. And then E is environment and social, and just includes all those things on sort of the outside that might influence any of those. What are your vitamin D always comes to mind. What are your sun exposure habits? What's your occupation? Anything like that. And then even what's your stage of change? Are you interested in making these changes, or have you not even thought about it? So kind of everything's E and social or environmental social are kind of dumped into one category.
Awesome. I like that. Simplifies it, gives you some structure or framework to go off of when you meet with an athlete. And can you share some common challenges when you're assessing dietary intake of an athlete and how those challenges might be mitigated? Maybe some of the common things maybe you see in practice, but certainly what did you see, or did you share any of that in the article as well?
Sure. Yeah. And that's like such a big topic, just sitting down and asking an athlete what they eat, you have to, like sometimes you do when you're in a hurry, but really, there's lots of different possibilities. And probably when you're talking to an athlete, doing food records, even though they're a little bit more cumbersome, is still probably the best way to go. If you could do, 3 to 5 days, would be great. Longer would certainly give us more information, but I'm sure, or even any listener who's done it, there's probably recording fatigue. So I could get great data over 2 weeks if people would just, really do it well over 2 weeks. But and then there's just food frequency questionnaires, and those are nice, and they're pretty easy for someone to fill out. The problem, of course, is they're limited on foods, and a food frequency questionnaire might give you an indication of maybe how much fruits and vegetables somebody's consuming, or nutrients like vitamin D and iodine, even vitamin C. but not energy. And it's not even the best for protein overall. So macronutrients, it's not particularly good at. I guess I also didn't say even with the reporting of the food records, people tend to underreport for the most part. So there's always, you look at a food record and, oh wow, the person's reporting 3,000 calories. Maybe it's close to 3,000, maybe it's just 3,100, but maybe it's significantly underreporting. And then they also tend to report foods, I guess leave out foods that they might think that you don't want them to consume. So those are always the problems. And then there's just, a great detailed diet history that you can take in the clinic. And those are better for looking at, I guess, the quality of the diet, what people are typically eating, but not, putting it through and quantifying it and actually getting an idea about what people are really eating. And then a lot, NHANES and other studies use 24-hour recalls. And if you do those should be random and, do like 2 or 3 of them as opposed to just one. And sometimes people do try and publish research with just one 24-hour recall. And we know they could be very different on what the athlete is eating that day. But the advantage is if people already ate it, they really already ate it. So they're not changing what they're eating just based on what you think that, or what you think the dietitian wants them to eat. But then there's problem with recall, but they do have some techniques that can be done, a multi-pass and very strict criteria that a dietitian can train themselves to do a better job of, to increase the accuracy of that. So
yeah, with the 24-hour recall, how is one getting portions, or are they not?
Yeah, though definitely they are trying. And if you do that on a regular basis, food models, or just having a series of cups, or if you work it with athletes that are eating in a certain cafeteria or certain location, you can bring in real glasses from that environment and show them to the athletes, real plates. And the more you can visually show people, the better.
Yeah.
I would say overall. And then of course there's new procedures that are coming up, like food photography and taking pictures, but those are even difficult. You really have to train yourself to look at food on the plate and then say, oh, that's what a half a cup looks like when it's mashed potatoes on my plate. Or
yeah, the food photography, it is an interesting area. I've seen that on some apps where you take a photo and it tries to calculate the caloric content for you. And what are your thoughts on that in terms of accuracy?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I don't know. And I think, and thinking about all this artificial intelligence that we have now, that probably those things are going to get a little bit better over time for certain foods. But if you standardize or use standardized foods, it's going to end up that way. But you can think about anything that is prepared in one time, like mashed potatoes. One time they're very firm. You put the half a cup on there, the 2 scoops, and they remain solid. And then next time another chef makes them, and they're a little bit runnier. Yeah, there's so many factors to account for.
Totally.
That's just always one of those things in our field. I don't, we have to work towards making things more and more accurate, but there's just always a degree of error in that as well. And then another degree of error, and I always spend a lot of time talking about this to my students, is we always assume that if we look it up in a nutrient database and it says broccoli has 50 milligrams of vitamin C, that's exactly what broccoli has. When the new databases are really nice, you can look to the side and it'll say, well, this was based on 12 samples, and it will tell you where the broccoli or where the food was obtained for. So you know that the broccoli coming from my garden, I mean, it's high in vitamin C, but that doesn't mean that it's exactly that number.
Yeah.
And if you want, everybody, well, students and everyone to realize that. And then that also goes deeper in asking, well, just because you're having broccoli, how long has it sat in your refrigerator? Like we all do with the athletes. Well, I bought it 2 weeks ago. It still looked good. So I cooked it. You're like, I'm sure there's vitamin C in there still, but it's not like the same amount on the day it was picked from, I guess the garden. And the day you bought it. So
right. Yeah, you bring up a great point. And so for our listeners, what I think you're getting at there, the vitamin C content from picking to how long it sits in your fridge or on the shelf in the store declines with, would you say like age off the branch, or off the plant, that it
I like
decreases?
that, age off the branch.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so many things that influence it, and that's definitely one of them. And even the growing conditions, when you think about that, I guess I learned a bit ago at a nutrition talk that more stressed vegetables or more stressed plants make the fruits and vegetables with higher higher amounts of some of the good things that they have in there, like plant-based. For some reason I'm blanking on the word, and it's a really common word. You guys get phytonutrients is in
Oh,
one. Yeah. But just so the more stressed the plant
or like
is, the more they make.
polyphenols and
Polyphenols is what I'm blanking. Oh,
yeah, I got it with the P.
like, what is
pH.
it? What is it?
Yeah, that makes sense. So the fresher the better, it sounds like, with the produce when you can get it. And kind of circling back to the food journaling piece, out of curiosity, do you have any food like journaling, whether it's apps or softwares that you find to be maybe more user friendly for the athlete or the client, and more successful for them to get that food journaling done? Or do you have them write by hand? What do you think technique
We
wise is
stuck
more
with
successful?
the writing by hand, and I think
Mhm.
that was because we started doing it that way, and
Mhm.
we didn't want to change, so we ended up, combining data. For our food frequency questionnaires or just more global assessments,
Mhm.
it's interesting the amount of research that's growing out there. So there's an Australian diet index that is available. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but anyone
Mm.
can fill it out, and
Mm.
then you're emailed your results. And what it does is comprehensively look at what the athlete is eating, amounts of fruits and vegetables and dairy products and protein sources, and then it will give them a score. And it's based on not just your typical dietary guidelines, but also what's recommended for athletes. Higher
Mm.
the protein than grams of carbohydrate per
Yeah.
kilogram, and they are using that to increase the research on that is available and make the product better. But you just elect to have your information included in the frequency questionnaire results. So that's what we use that a lot. But then I've learned recently that there's a handful of them that other people have developed as
Mm.
well. So
That's neat. I have not heard of that one. We'll have to check that out. The Australian Diet Index. We will link that in the show notes too for the listeners if they want to
yeah.
play around with that. A big piece of the athlete or nutrition assessment is energy availability, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Can you walk us through maybe explaining too for some of the listeners, what is energy availability and how do we determine if we're hitting the mark there or not?
Yeah, that's it's really important in assessment of it. Of course, like everything is associated with, say, some issues and then even a little bit of controversial. So it's really a controversy. It's really the amount of energy. Well, I guess if I step back for a second, we used to think in terms of energy balance,
Mm.
calories in versus calories that were expended or, eaten compared to expended. And that did make some sort of sense, but if you are out there exercising and you're under eating, you're going to finish your workout. So that energy is going to be expended doing exercise. And then you're going to have less energy theoretically for the rest of the day, again, if you're under eating. So
Mm.
that concept, I think it was actually coined by Anne Lux, but
Mm.
I'm sure about that, but she was involved if it wasn't just her in the beginning
Mhm.
discussing that. So what you do is you look at the difference between, or you pull out the energy expenditure that from exercise from your total energy intake, and then you divide that by the fat-free mass. So you
Mhm.
sort of adjusted for based on fat-free mass. And
Mhm.
then there's certain cutoffs that they think now are decent, less than 30 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass, then might be associated with maybe at risk for having low energy availability and some of its complications.
Mhm.
But those numbers were developed in women, so there's a lot of research going on to see if men have the same threshold. And then again, because of you have the error not only of estimating food intake, but then also calories for energy expenditure, which that's also another difficult situation. But I do want to just take a chance. There's a lot of people don't know about the physical activity continuum, and you can Google that, and I can also send you that. It was recently done, and it's a website, and you go on, and they have it divided by, they have wheelchair athletes, they have older athletes, and then they have adult athletes. Well, not athletes, but in general. And then you can look up physical activity. And so just the other day, we looked up running, and it nicely shows you, well, if you're running at this mile per hour, or that mile per hour, and, you know, of course, there's like a 10 or 12 or 15 maybe different options. And that's probably the best way to estimate it. But then with that said, it's fairly easy to estimate, or straightforward estimating the energy needs of running or cycling if you're on a bike, particularly if you have an app or a watch and it says you averaged, you know, if you're on a bike, you know, maybe 17 miles per hour, and then you can average that. But you think about when you're a soccer athlete or a basketball athlete, and how much time were you on the bench, and how much time were you standing there, and how much time were you fully sprinting, and those sports are a lot more difficult too.
Right. Yeah. Is that similar to METs, the metabolic equivalent? I forget what the T stands for. Where it does have that similar breakdown with the run pacing, mile per hour, but there's a multiplier based off of the body weight. Is that kind of similar concept? Or maybe it is.
Yeah, it's, you know, the MET came from public health. So you're right, it's 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight. But I think it was sort of where one MET was at rest, and then walking is about 3 MET, so 3 times your metabolic rate at rest. I think that's I personally, when I'm trying to talk to people, I think it's more difficult than thinking about calories, but I guess it depends on your frame of reference. Public health uses it to sort of estimate, is it light activity, is it moderate activity, or is it intense activity? But often a lot of what the athletes that are training, you know, they're hardly even at moderate ever. Like moderate is probably light too. Light. But I guess we don't use it a lot in those estimates. But it can be really helpful for sure. And then the continuum does have METs that can be converted back to calories.
Awesome. Gotcha. We'll have to check that out. And we will link that in the show notes too for the listeners. You called it the physical activity continuum. Is that what
Compendium.
Compendium. Okay. Amazing.
Yeah.
We'll link that one. And kind of, I mean, we're talking about different ways to manage that energy balance or energy availability. If an athlete is potentially, we mentioned LEA, or low energy availability, and our listeners, I think at this point, hopefully should know what that is, because we've had several RED-S and LEA researchers on our podcast and breaking that down. But what would be some of the things where maybe an athlete might be in a low energy availability, or signs that maybe they need to up the nutrition intake to support their energy?
Yeah, those are also kind of, I mean, you think overall difficult for the most part. If an athlete has probably been low energy availability for a while, you start to see things like, you know, fatigue and not getting the response that you would expect from their exercise physical training. In the early stages, and I'm sure some of your previous guests have talked about that, athletes can tend to like do well for a certain amount of time. And some athletes under a low energy availability almost feel a little bit of a high. They feel great. And then like suddenly there's a crash. But we can see it if we were to do some laboratory values. You can look at thyroid hormone, and you can see differences in T3, T4, and then increases in R T3 if those tests were ordered. There within the thyroid, there's something called euthyroid sick syndrome. And it's what hospitalized patients get it, but you can see something that is really very similar under conditions of low energy availability. So it's almost like the body's not getting enough energy, so it's down regulating metabolism. And it's doing that probably partially through changes in thyroid hormone.
Interesting. what kind of timeline would you want to test thyroid, and how soon potentially, having someone been in low energy availability, would you see those changes occur?
Yeah, I don't know that I can completely answer that question exactly, thinking about it, because it's probably the degree of energy restriction that is
Right.
occurring and everything else. And we did do a 5 days of experimentally induced low energy availability in people who we had determined were not in energy, or they started out and that they were eating fine, eating adequate amounts. And we did, at the end of the 5 days, it was done to actually look at some bone changes, but we did get thyroid markers, and we did start to see some changes. But I think you'd have to go out a couple weeks in order to start seeing them. But I could be completely wrong. I'd have to really dig into the literature and address that
Yeah.
question. I think it's a great one, how soon
Yeah.
you pick up those changes.
Yeah.
And
And I think you brought up a great point too, with the mention of some athletes, maybe there's a weight loss goal too, initially, with sports that maybe there's that kind of power to weight ratio going on, and they do feel better because they're starting to get faster. And like you're saying, a bit of time goes by and eventually something's happening physiologically, right? Where, in addition to the low energy availability, where the body does hit that wall and that crash. And I mean, I've seen athletes where they hit that wall and they think they kind of like one thing will change it in a short period of time, but it potentially was a longer process to get there. I mean, would you say even like up to a couple of months before this like crash burnout could happen for some people?
I think it's probably, yeah, pretty fair. And then for other athletes, maybe they make it through the, season and they do really well. And then, you see them a little later, and sometimes you just know, and you're used to looking at athletes, and then suddenly, I don't know, you feel like they've crossed the edge to some extent. Before they were thin and they looked fit, and now they're thin and they look, yeah, there's something there. And it's really just kind of a gut feeling from looking at athletes and sort of thinking, yeah, maybe we should start talking about making some changes and figure out why you're not eating enough.
Yeah. And kind of jumping back to your ABCDE framework situation there, right? You could use some of those tools to reassess that athlete throughout the season to check in on those things, huh? Right?
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's sort of the whole idea, is that you think about all the pieces that are going on and not just one thing. And that's, I think, a common thing. Either, I think athletes will even do this. I don't know if this has happened to you guys. You see somewhere, you're out at the grocery store at a party and somebody runs up, or they find what you do, and they give you this one little, piece, and you're supposed to provide advice. And in the beginning of being a dietitian, you want to be helpful, so maybe you answer it. And now it's like, well, make an appointment. And we really have to assess all the pieces before I can say anything to you, because I might miss something completely.
Right.
That's not correct.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
all important in looking at what's going on and making that nutrition diagnosis. And then also from the pieces, knowing, well, what's the best intervention?
Right. Yes. And what would be the most successful for that client to implement, change-wise? And the environment piece, I think, is a big component to that E of your framework. Do they have supportive family members? Do they live alone? Do they have low access to food around them? Are they in a food desert? Like, I think all of those things are, so important and play a big piece of the puzzle. So I like that there's that well-rounded approach when you're assessing an athlete, like you're saying, instead of just taking one nugget of information and trying to base a whole protocol off of that. Okay, so moving kind of a little bit onward from that, where do you see the future of nutrition assessment heading with all these technological advances? We touched a little bit on the AI photo, like food journaling. I know there's certainly quite a bit of CGM, like continuous glucose monitors, becoming more available for the public and non-diabetics to utilize as a tool. Where do you see this going, and for the clinicians utilizing any of it as a tool to help them in their practices potentially?
Yeah, I mean, it is nice that AI came up. And so if we even just think about all the different pieces, I was going to mention the body composition
Oh, yeah.
analysis, and just because that's like a piece that's really changed recently, which is nice. And in the beginning, I think at least I did a lot of just body composition analysis, percent body fat, and I wasn't always comfortable, I would say, doing it and giving the results. But, when you're first starting your career, and then that was, I guess, thought to be the norm, and giving people results that maybe they, didn't need to hear. But the first thing is, you're getting height and weight is really useful. And some other things like circumferences, but you can't always get it. So kind of a first piece of that assessment is the athlete, is this a good idea, and does this have a benefit? So a lot of, indeed, we talked about assessing energy availability. Well, to do that, you do have to have fat-free mass, but you're really concerned about the athlete, maybe even taking their weight. Sure, you can have them turn around, but that, maybe that's not the time to do it. And then you got a step further and say, well, maybe it's not time to do body composition. What is knowing their percent body fat really going to add to this? And many times it does add. Athlete is doing a lot of training, or maybe they've been injured and you want to know what's changing, but are they an adult? Is there going to be any harm to this? So you have to almost have to assess whether, what anthropometrics you should do, even though technically it's important. B is a really nice one. It's kind of my favorite one, the biochemical, and it's what my lab is doing a lot of. We do not have right now good status markers for every nutrient. And the ones that we do, vitamin D was one that we initially had. We thought, oh, this is great. We have this marker in blood, 25 hydroxy vitamin D, and then research came out and said, well, maybe it's not the total, but it's the free form. So now that's kind of back in the research. I think for Caucasians, the total is probably fine, but for African Americans specifically, and maybe other specific ethnic groups, maybe free is better. Free is now more expensive. So still, we do have a marker for vitamin D. Things like vitamin C and folate, we can measure that in blood. It's probably a little bit more expensive than some. And then iron, we have great iron markers. We just need to remember to use not just one, but a couple to assess iron. But then calcium's one of those ones, like, wouldn't it be great if we had a marker of calcium status, so we could make more, I guess, put some better advice related to calcium intake. But the calcium in the blood is strongly regulated by hormones, very tightly regulated. So that's never going to be a good marker. You could measure calcium in a 24-hour urine to maybe give you an indicator of intake, but probably your diet assessment is going to be just as good, if not better than that.
Yeah.
So I guess in rumbling on and on, hopefully we will be identifying some better markers over time that would probably be useful for us. And again, my lab is really interested in iodine. We're interested in magnesium, iron. So who knows?
How are you,
people?
how are you measuring iodine? Is that via blood or urine, or what's the best way for that?
So
you don't see that on a usual blood test usually, right?
No, not at all. And so the sort of the gold standard, even though it's not really a gold standard for individuals, is a 24-hour urine. But then if you really want to do a good job, you should do multiple 24-hour urines in. And that's in athletes, you can get people to do it. I just worked with a colleague, and he did get 24-hour urines in a group of hockey players, and they were just interested enough that they're like, yeah, we're going to do it. But the whole concept with urine, and maybe, are you drug testing? That's, or just being suspicious of that, or not wanting to collect urine for a full 24 hours, which is a hassle. Back to the iodine. It's still our best marker. We did do we looked at serum iodine at the same time, and we actually did a trial where we gave people, we had them follow an iodine-free diet as much as they could, and leave out the key sources of iodine for 3 days, and took a 24-hour urine, and then we gave them the RDA for iodine for 3 days, and then we gave them 3 times the RDA of iodine for 3 days, and that came from table salt. And then we looked at what that did with the markers, and serum iodine is promising, but it's still it didn't knock anyone's socks off. So we need
Mm,
more studies on
yeah.
that coming. So I guess overall, I'm hoping there'll be more markers that are developed that I don't even know about for nutrients, because that would certainly help us know more about things like zinc and magnesium.
Yeah. Yeah. That
Um,
would be great. For our listeners, well, first I would say my question is the iodine, you're looking into that for thyroid function?
mhm.
Okay.
Yes,
And
yes.
what would be iodine rich food sources?
Our most consistent source, if people use iodized salt,
Hmm.
is really iodized salt. But the foods that are, I don't even want to say naturally containing iodine, but naturally are seaweed and seafoods and
Mm,
fish
mhm.
in general. But not a lot of people eat those on a regular basis. And then our research has suggested that some, and it agrees with other people, that some of our best sources of iodine are dairy products. So that includes milk and cheese, and then also eggs. And the iodine in there comes from just what required by the raising of the animal. So
Oh,
iodine was either added in feed, or there's sterilants that are used, like by many dairy farms to
I
sort of
see.
keep the teats of the cow clean. And
Hmm.
um, there's also stabilizers that can be used in dough, but it's not consistent. So
Mhm.
but our research, it was actually simple. We were talking about the food frequency questionnaire, looked at iodine status compared to what they were reporting in the food frequency questionnaire. And the best predictors were not iodized salt, but were reported iodized salt, let's just say, and
Mm,
were milk and dairy products. Well,
interesting.
dairy products and eggs. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah. With the iodized salt, obviously there's so many different types of salt on the market, the pink Himalayan and the sea salt. Those don't have iodine in them. If you buy them like that, you need to buy the specifically iodized salt.
Yes, most of them don't. And I used to say they never did, but then every once in a while you pick up, in the grocery store, you see, oh, that sea salt does say that it's iodized, but
Oh,
typically they aren't. And then
yeah,
athletes are eating in a cafeteria, you're from the salt shaker, you have no idea. But
right.
the sodium in processed foods are not iodized.
Yeah, interesting. That's good to know. Okay, so one last thing actually I did want to ask you. Are you familiar with a test? I think it's called a Nutra eval test. And I forget if they do blood and urine or just urine. Are you familiar with that test?
I am not. What's it called? The Nutrient E?
Nutra eval, and it might be by Genova Diagnostics. I think they might have
Hmm.
been at one of the conferences I went to, and they were bringing it up, and it looked a lot at different food nutrients, micronutrients, and the different pathways biochemically, and somehow they were able to get information from that. But I was curious if it's legit, and if that's something you had heard of or not. But yeah, if you look it up, let me know what you find
I
out.
will. I
I'm
will. I wrote
curious.
that down. That's actually
Yeah,
very, very
yeah,
interesting. Yeah, there's
neat.
a lot of emerging things for sure. Yeah, I
Hmm.
was also going to say, just real quick, I think we were marching through the ABCDs. It's so easy
Yes.
to get off task, but
Yeah.
on new things. And the C, I really like the C, and the fact that dietitians are now being trained to do nutrition focused physical exam. And
Mm.
I know there was a group that just attempted to, they're working on a nutrition focused physical exam specifically for athletes.
Cool.
Light of a takeoff, and they were trying to do some attempts to validate what should be included in there and not. So I think it'll be exciting when that comes out, and I don't
Yeah.
know when that is, but just being trained to look for things that I think in the past we just relied on the physician doing is
Mm.
excitement, and of all this is going to change. And then we're also learning a lot about more and more, I would see, about drug. Well, I think it's probably better to say not drug nutrient interaction, but food drug interactions, and think about supplements, and having
Hmm.
great sources to look that up. And unfortunately, one of the best sources I think is LexiComp, but I know that's not available to everyone
Mm-hmm.
depending upon the cost. But I think it would be nice to have those sources more up to date and readily available
Yeah.
to, say athletes themselves. But then looking them up, because sometimes when you look them up, the a nutrient side effect or food side effect isn't included. And it could potentially, if you're on a medication for a while, it could have a big influence on your nutritional status.
Yes.
Let's see what's next. D. I think we talked a bit about the D, and I think things are changing with, food apps and that thing, and being able to take pictures, and, maybe we'll get a little bit better at, or having a simple way that athletes can, just click a button on their phone and record what they eat versus, cumbersome. And then, E is always going to continue to evolve, but sorry, I thought I would kind of march through.
No, this is great.
Ease of that.
And kind of actually touching on E, talking about environment, what kind of things are you maybe looking for that could be helpful in your recommendation for that client or athlete when you're talking about E?
Well, you mentioned some of them that I, did it in the beginning, which I think are, important: access to food, and then, can the athlete cook? Where does the athlete live? Who they live with? Those things. And then it's also been nice to see a lot of information coming out on assessing food insecurity in athletes, which is something that I don't know in the past if we just didn't think it happened, but now that it's been brought to everybody's attention, I think we're really, sports dietitians are thinking a little bit more about, like, with, say, the low energy availability. Are you under eating because you were doing that intentionally, or you're under eating because you can't afford food? And they're very different, animals on how we go about assessing those things.
Right. Yes.
So I think we try and think comprehensively on anything that can happen, but like anything, there's always something that, more heads are better than one. Somebody will say, well, do you assess that? And we're like, no, that's a really good point. We don't. But
yeah. Wow. I think these are all, again, super helpful, again, framework and different areas maybe people were not thinking about before to start to consider, certainly when they're assessing an athlete. So I definitely appreciate you breaking that down. Do you, I mentioned the CGMs, but do you ever see use of that in your practice with athletes or anything like that?
Yeah, we interestingly, so we do use those in the lab. We use the Pro, and we did just finish the study, the one I mentioned, the low energy availability study that we did 4 or 5 days. We did do CGMs on them, just kind of a pilot to see if it was useful or not. And it's a reminder that I need to work with the student who just finished it. She just presented in summer, and so we get that paper out. But I think it was interesting in that situation, maybe did have some promise. I think, like a lot of people, I think that they're becoming available to athletes maybe a bit too soon without the knowledge of the normal fluctuation in blood sugar. And one example that even I think students sometimes have a hard time understanding is if you go out and do a very intense workout, that your blood sugar is going to go high, and it's going to go pretty high, and that's normal, and you want that to be able to do an endurance event or to have high blood sugar for a little bit. It's not really high, it just goes up during exercise. But people see that and it's like, oh gosh, maybe I'm over fueling, maybe I've consumed too much carbohydrate. And so we need either probably some research in those that are maybe more geared at not what's happening for the whole day, because you get a whole day of data and you get a lot of data, and then you get 3 or 4 days, and then you're like, well, how actually do I analyze this? And we're having a lot of discussions. There's ways that you can do it. You can look at like how much the blood sugar deviates from what would be the typical blood sugar. Do you have any lows? But then so we might have to go in and fit things like, well, blood sugar went up, and what does that area under the curve look like? Maybe that's a good deal, but I don't know that the software for doing that simply is quite there yet. So we're really in that experimental phase with the use of CGMs.
Yeah, that is very interesting too. It makes me think, talking about the elevations in blood sugar when you exercise, could that be something where if there's an endurance athlete and they're spending a lot of hours in an exertional state, and that blood sugar is staying elevated for a long period of time, is that enough to affect their HbA1c rating?
So, I don't think I think like if we go back to why that's happening, it's kind of that imbalance between at that point you start to do some intense exercise. So the release of glucose into the bloodstream increases greater than the uptake of into the muscle. But then eventually you're going to sort of run out of, I guess carbohydrate stores in the liver and muscle. So I don't think it's going to last very long. And I don't think we see that. I mean, it's a great question. But I don't think it really lasts that long. It's mainly just misinterpreting something that's normal physiology with, oh, am I eating too much carbohydrate? It's not, it doesn't even happen necessarily in relation to carbohydrate intake. It could just be quick release of glucose from glucose stores from liver glycogen at that point when you start sprinting. Like I remember early in the day when you learn about type 1 diabetes, and I was like, well, if you ever have low blood sugar, like just go sprint and your blood sugar will go back into normal. But it's so counterintuitive, obviously. Like, that doesn't last because it's a short-term fix while you make sure you get enough carbohydrate intake. But it's all about the balance.
Yes. Yeah. Very interesting area for sure. I would be curious to see more in that area. Okay. So as we're getting close on time, I have a couple more questions for you. Are there any suggestions you have for athletes on how they can balance their need for precise nutritional assessment? And, oh, I'm sorry, I read this in my second question. My first question, advice you would give to athletes who want to improve their understanding of their own nutritional needs?
Yeah, I think it's great to, that my first answer wants to be, hopefully you can find a sports dietitian and learn from them. But one of my favorite books when I'm falling back is, I still like Nancy Clark's sports nutrition book, and most libraries have it. It's an easy read. It was done at a nice level that's not above anyone's head, but yet very informative and, solid information. So I would probably recommend if they were interested in reading, and then, if they had a chance to meet with the sports dietitian. Interestingly, I have some students that there's always probably seems like one a year coming in, and they're like, well, when I was in high school, I had some issues and I met with the sports dietitian, and, she changed my life, and here I am because I really like what, So
that's great.
It was extremely important. And then, it's what you guys are doing is great too. Like, congratulations. It's very exciting having something that athletes can just listen to and learn as they go, and little tidbits and educating yourself, because there's so much misinformation out there.
Yes, that's why we have professionals like you on here to help get through all the misinformation, certainly. Okay, and then last kind of question here, any suggestions for how athletes can balance the need for the precise nutritional assessment with the potential stress of the constant tracking and monitoring of their diet?
That's such an awesome question. I think athletes always, if you're have that level of perfectionism, so they want to not just do the right thing, but more than the right thing. And I wish I had some really amazing words of wisdom, other than the fact that it's not an exact science, so to speak. You really just have to educate yourself as much as possible, and sometimes that's a little bit of trial and error, and not expecting to say be perfect in absolutely everything, but progress over time. We think back to, in yoga, they often say, well, it's called yoga practice because you're working your way, you're practicing your way, and you're never going to be there because you're always practicing. Maybe there's some elements in there on that aspect. But.
Yeah, it certainly makes me think, a lot of the teams, they'll have a sports nutritionist, but they'll also have a sports psych or a sports physio. And so having that other piece of the puzzle to help with the mental side of things, if there are stressors going on, I think that's an area too that's kind of emerging a little bit more, to kind of evolving outside of the disordered eating in sport, or disordered eating and then disordered eating in sport, or LEA in sport, and that area, I think, from a sports psych world, is certainly becoming more prominent, and there's more access to that, I think, now, which is great. So
Mhm.
yeah. Okay. Well, again, I want to be mindful of your time. So I'm going to jump us back to our two truths and a lie. So hopefully we can all learn some takeaways from this. So, and it said a single Brazil nut gives you your RDA for selenium, that beef and pork and poultry are the most absorbable sources of magnesium, and that regular consumption of green vegetables provide excellent sources of K1 for bone health. We were thinking the beef and poultry magnesium source was the lie. Were we right?
You were right. Yeah. Yeah.
The schooling paid off.
It did. Yes, exactly. And the
Awesome.
selenium thing is so interesting. Single brand Brazil nut, but not more, or
Yeah.
we have more, a handful, have it once a week. Because I guess,
Mhm.
potentially you could if you ate them on a regular basis. But yeah, the magnesium one is
Mhm.
magnesium is pretty well absorbed, about 50%. And our sources of magnesium in the diet are everything we want people to eat, like legumes, green leafy vegetables, whole grains, and nuts and seeds. And
Mm.
it's not found in processed foods, and there's a little bit in meat, but not very much. So
Yeah.
it's thought that a lot of the US and probably other countries have suboptimal magnesium status, and we need to eat more good
Yes.
whole
One
grain
of my
leafy vegetables, legumes, nuts and seeds.
Yes. And magnesium, correct me if I'm wrong here. I thought I recall from one of my professors in my undergrad, they had broken down similar to what you were saying with the vitamin C, grabbing, eating the produce while it's fresh to get a higher vitamin C content. They were kind of breaking down the soil quality having an effect of the magnesium content in the produce. So magnesium grown, or sorry, not magnesium grown, but maybe like asparagus grown in Santa Cruz, California versus asparagus grown in, I don't know, upstate New York, potentially could have different magnesium values. Is that something you see as well, or?
Yeah, where we talk about that the most is selenium and iodine, because the
Mm,
content of minerals does depict, well, what the plants and then even the animals that are
mm,
living on there and then eating, the plant foods. I haven't seen a lot about magnesium, but I'm sure it's also true, because it's also true a little bit for iron as well.
mm.
Yeah, making
That
sure.
makes sense.
And that's, a lot of agricultures, you require fertilizers, but some of them don't have the right things added back in, and our
Mm.
soil quality is just in many places but that's another topic. It's
Yes.
definitely.
Yes. Yeah. Well, speaking of other topics is or for our listeners, like I said, Annette has published loads of publications, and one of the ones that she's very versed in obviously is thyroid health, hence a little bit of the nuggets she shared today with us. Certainly would love to have you back to talk about some of that in the future, but I know we want to be mindful of your time and get you on your way. So for our listeners, definitely check that stuff out. And then where can they find you and follow you?
Oh, yeah. So I'm mostly on, I guess, X now. It's Enette Meyer RD. I have not branched into Instagram yet, and that's probably, or I am accessible by email as well. I'm at Virginia Tech, and I was lucky enough that since my name is kind of unusual, that it's just enette@vt.edu, which is kind of lovely.
Nice.
So it's easy to remember.
Perfect. Yes. Well, we will share all that in the show notes for the listeners, and the article we talked about today and several other things we talked about. We'll link all that below for the listeners. And then thank you again so much for joining us, Annette. This is always a good learning experience for myself too, to have folks like yourself on and specialists, and yeah, really wonderful learning experience. So thank you again.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And again, for what you guys are doing with these
Oh,
podcasts. I think it's great.
thank you.